Apple released the iPhone 11 family a couple months ago, with the cheapest of these phones being the iPhone 11, which retails for just under $700. Comparing that to 2017's iPhone 10, which landed on the market for $1,000, the iPhone 11 is 30% cheaper than the 2-year-old flagship. But Apple isn't the only one making their phones cheaper. Samsung, for the first time in half a decade, released a cheaper version of one of their flagships. Google also released their own budget Google Pixel 3a, which was aggressively marketed as a rival to the iPhone X. And Chinese smartphone maker Huawei has kept hold of their market share in Europe by reselling some of their older budget phones. The move to making cheaper phones is taking place almost immediately. But why? Why are companies more worried now than they've ever been about making cheaper phones? Well, that's what we're here to find out today. You're watching The Gizmo Show, and without further ado, this video starts now. Now, the two reasons for the sudden switch to budget phones are the same two reasons why companies wanted to charge so much for their phones in the first place: staying relevant and making more money. Now, you may be wondering what either of these two things have to do with how expensive or affordable a smartphone turns out to be, so let me explain. Starting with relevancy. It doesn't matter how flashy and new a smartphone is. If the company making the phone is unimportant or irrelevant, don't expect that particular company to sell a lot of phones. Take Huawei, for example. Huawei is one of the most, if not the most popular smartphone company in China, and about 50% of the phones Huawei sells are sold in China. But over here in the US, Huawei is practically invisible, with only 1% of all phones sold in the US being made by Huawei. Another example of this would be Apple. Now, Apple doesn't always introduce the latest and greatest technology, but because of the brand reputation the company has, people still continue to buy their phones. So it's not a matter of how good a smartphone is, but how popular the company behind it is. So how does this affect price? Well, let's take a trip down memory lane back to the iPhone 10. Back when it was released, phones were still expensive devices, but not nearly as expensive as the 10. As aforementioned, the phone hit the market for $1,000. Now, as we know, the more someone charges for something, the better people think it is. Now, this is why luxury cars are thought to be better than regular cars. The same goes for smartphones as well. Phones aren't always judged based on the tech they feature or how good the phone actually is, but how much it costs. This left other companies conflicted. If they allowed their phones to remain cheaper than Apple's, it would lead people to think that Apple's phones are superior to any other. And the last thing any company wants is to be overshadowed by an already incredibly popular company. So, gradually, smartphone prices rose and continued to rise, and before anyone knew it, smartphones as a majority had gained a reputation for being expensive, one that lives on even to today. Companies raised the prices of their phones, not because they were scamming consumers, not because they felt like they could trick loyal customers out of their precious money, but because they would be deemed irrelevant if they did otherwise. It's just as I said before. Making good phones is one thing, but you can't expect to sell a phone to anyone if you're an irrelevant company and no one knows you exist. And sometimes, staying relevant means being just like everyone else. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the second reason why a company would charge fairly more for a smartphone is to make more money off of that particular phone. Now, as I mentioned in my last video, which you can watch by clicking the iCard above, Apple became the most valuable company in the world at $1 trillion thanks to help from the iPhone 10, which, as I've mentioned enough already, is pretty expensive. This shows us that companies make serious money off of their expensive phones, and reasonably so, as they are so expensive. And when other companies realized how successful they could be if their phones were slightly more expensive, it only gave them more reason to start increasing the prices. Put simply, the more expensive a phone is, the more you could have expected a company to profit off of that phone. Things stayed the same for a while. Companies continued to charge more and more for their phones. And as time went on, the community backlash against expensive phones seemed to have died down. It almost felt like this was the fate of future smartphones, that our devices would continue to get more and more expensive, and that there was nothing that could change that. But that was until late 2018. Around this time, Apple had released its three newest phones, the iPhone XS, XS Max, and XR, the XR being the cheapest of these three phones. At first, the iPhone XR had started off a little shaky. It was cheaper, yes, but it was a toned-down version of its older brothers, the iPhone XS and XS Max. This led many people, especially tech enthusiasts, to believe that the iPhone XR wouldn't do so well as Apple had expected. Things got worse when news came out that the iPhone XR was not selling well compared to the other phones Apple had to offer. With all of this, it had seemed like the XR was soon going to be phased out into the immense world of smartphone failures and mishaps, until the unthinkable happened. The iPhone XR became the best-selling smartphone in the whole first half of 2019, selling just under 27 million units, topping out Samsung, Huawei, OnePlus, and even Apple's own XS and XS Max. This took the smartphone world by surprise, tech enthusiasts and companies alike. Nobody suspected that the XR, being inferior to the XS and XS Max, would end up selling better than both of these phones. I mean, the iPhone XS didn't even make it on the top 10. Now that's saying something. And while strong sales of the XR meant good news for Apple, it meant bad news for other companies. The idea that expensive phones sell better than cheaper phones all of a sudden didn't seem to make much sense. Because if the iPhone XR can manage to outdo everyone while still being 25% cheaper than a majority of smartphones, then how are companies going to believe that their super expensive smartphones were going to make them any money? It gets better when you put into perspective that the following 4 phones on the list were all mid-range or cheaper phones, including phones from Samsung's Galaxy A mid-range series and Xiaomi's own Redmi 6A. It became pretty clear to many companies that their $1,000 flagships were soon going to be overshadowed by more affordable, cheaper phones. In fact, none of Samsung's flagships, including the entire S10 family, made it on the list. And none of Huawei's devices made it on the list at all. It was clear that the smartphone world was changing. The expensive phones that companies thought would rank in tons of money were soon to be overshadowed by much cheaper phones that apparently were more popular with consumers. This goes back to the whole relevancy thing I brought up earlier. Apple, once again, had started a new trend. Only this time, instead of increasing smartphone prices like they did with the iPhone X, it was lowering them. And as always, if Apple started a trend, then other companies were soon to follow. Because if you can't beat them, join them. And it was very clear that companies couldn't beat the iPhone XR with their $1,000 flagships. This led companies to do the opposite of what they did before and not necessarily lower smartphone prices. I mean, smartphones are still pretty expensive, but do what Apple did and offer budget or cheaper models of their more expensive phones. This is what led Samsung to release the Galaxy S10e as a cheaper S10 and as a XR rival. And compared to the specs that the XR had to offer, I'd say that the S10e did its job pretty well. But this isn't the only thing Samsung did in response to the XR. They've also started taking their mid-range line of smartphones a little seriously now, releasing specific and multiple advertisements to draw attention to these phones, regardless of whether those advertisements in question actually made sense or not.
I know what I mean, yeah that I know where I'm at, yeah that I roll, yeah that I roll, yeah that I...
Google also released their Pixel 3a as a way to show everyone that they could make budget phones too. Now, as I mentioned here before, revenue also plays a part here. The previous thinking was that expensive phones make more money, and that would make sense. You are charging more for something, you should expect to make more money off of it, right? Well, what matters here is not the amount you charge for your phone, but how many units of that phone you manage to sell. Just because a phone is costly doesn't mean the company behind it will make a lot of money from it. The Samsung Galaxy Note 10 Plus is one of those over $1,000 flagship phones, and you could argue that because it costs so much, it would make a lot of money for Samsung. But what if the Note 10 Plus didn't sell at all? Now that is highly unlikely, but what if it actually happened? How much would Samsung make from the Note 10 Plus? Well, I'll tell you, nothing. So we know that you need your phone to sell well to make money. So how can you get your phone to sell well? Well, the one thing someone will look at before specs or internals is price. It doesn't matter how much next generation, futuristic, innovative technology a phone offers. If you can't afford the phone, you're not buying it. The problem with many flagships is that people either can't or aren't willing to spend $1,000 to get one. There are probably dozens of people who wanted the Galaxy S10 Plus or iPhone XS Max, but seeing those price tags drove them away from those phones and to the iPhone XR. In short, cheaper phones make more money since their affordability makes them more accessible than more expensive phones. If companies continue to charge more and more for their phones, they would end up selling less and less units of those phones, and again, continue to be overshadowed by Apple and their slightly cheaper iPhone XR. You see, in a world with so many, and I mean so many smartphone companies, and most people only upgrading once every 2 to 3 years, companies are doing the best they can to ensure that the next phone you buy is theirs. Thank you so much for checking out this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give me a thumbs up. Really appreciate that. If you want to see more tech videos like this, the sub button will always be there. Until next time, this has been The Gizmo Show. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.